Hello, everybody. I'm Milena Deleva of the Elizabeth Hristov Foundation. For those of you who are new to our work, we are a Bulgarian-American nonprofit organization creating literary bridges between the Anglosphere and Bulgaria. As one of our goals is to promote Bulgarian literature, the art of translation is a major slice of our work. And this current series presents recent translations that have been already published or about to be published. And the final event in the series is next Tuesday, and we will discuss this year's Bulgarian novel to be published by Open Letter Books here in the United States, together with the author, translator, and editor, 4 Minutes by Natalia Deleva. We have been working with this American publisher for several years now, and hopefully the Bulgarian literature is slowly edging its way into the Anglophone consciousness, or rather, or maybe better, book market. Tonight, however, we will discuss the translations of work of Gayo Milev, a Bulgarian poet who lived in the very turbulent times at the beginning of the 20th century. And it's my pleasure to introduce our guests, starting with the translator, Tom Phillips, who has translated a substantial selection of Gayo Milev's work, and which have just been published in the UK magazine Raise Me. I will shortly post the link in the chat. It's available to order. And together with his collaborators in this literary adventure, Igov and Bozhil Hristov, Tom Phillips is also a writer and lecturer in creative writing and translation at Sofia University, and his translations of contemporary Bulgarian poetry have appeared in leading UK journals such as Modern Poetry in Translation, Spoken Poetry Today, The High Window, Black Box, Manifold, and Raise Me. Angel Igov, he teaches English literature and translation at Sofia University, and he has translated more than 15 books of prose and poetry and is a two-time winner of the Konstant Yankov Translation Award. He's the author of 3 novels and 2 short story collections. And his novel, A Short Tale of Shame, was published in the US by the Open Letter Books within the program that we co-run together with Open Letter that I already mentioned in the beginning. And here I would like to extend Angel's bio, with your permission, to mention that another Bulgarian book that was published within this same program by Open Letter, it's called The Same Night Awaits Us All by Hristov, and it has the poet Gayo Milev as one of the 2 main protagonists, and I highly recommend you check the book out to get a better sense and reference to the trying times he lived in. And finally, it's my pleasure to present Bozhil Hristov, who teaches grammar and historical linguistics at Sofia University. He holds a BA in English from Sofia University and a Master of Science in Teaching and PhD in General Linguistic and Comparative Philology from the Oxford University. His major publications are in linguistics, more specifically theoretical grammar and language change. And his translations of both Bulgarian and English poets have appeared in the Literary Gazette and the Free Poetry Society. As you can tell, this is a webinar and we cannot see you, but never mind, we would love to hear from you. So please use the chat for comments as we go with the event, the reading and the conversation, and the QA for questions after the conversation. So now I would like to turn it over to Tom and ask him to probably straight away tell us a bit about his adventure with Bulgarian language and literature, and about how you, Tom, first and when encountered Milev's work and decided to translate it.
Thank you, Milena, and well, thank you for inviting us to to take part in this event, and thank you to the Foundation for making it possible. It's really great to talk about this project, and also get a chance to thank Angel and Bozhil in public for being my amazing collaborators and helping me out, because perhaps the first thing to say about Gayo Milev's work is that well, it's rarely been translated into English before. I mean, I think to my knowledge, only his long poem September has actually been published in English, and that was translated originally in the 1960s, I think. So yes, how did this start? Well, I started translating Bulgarian literature for entirely selfish reasons. And that was because I wanted to read Bulgarian literature, and there's not much actually available in English, or there certainly wasn't, and it's been getting a lot better lately, but at that time. And so I've mainly translated living Bulgarian poets, contemporary Bulgarian poets so far, which is a little, well, it was easier for me because I knew most of them and they're friends of mine. And so I could have conversations with them saying things like, what exactly do you mean by that? And that kind of stuff. And I'd sort of not really explored older Bulgarian poetry. And then, yeah, not long after we moved to Sofia, 3.5 years ago, I was doing a poetry reading actually in Stara Zagora, which is where Gayo Milev grew up. And my publisher arranged for me to go to the Gayo Milev House Museum there. And at that point, I have to admit, I didn't really know a great deal about him. I'd heard his name, and I perhaps read a part of the translation of September. And we went to the house, and we were given a fantastic tour around the house by the curator, who's just so enthusiastic. It's just brilliant. And she kind of showed us all these amazing rooms where he grew up and everything. And as we were going around, they also have quite a collection of his publications and magazines that he worked on. And I realized that, A, he's incredibly energetic and prolific writer, and uncovering, he was a journalist, a critic, a playwright, a poet. He painted, so he's an extraordinarily wide-ranging artist of all kinds, and that drew my attention. Then also the fact that it was evident that he was heavily influenced by German expressionism and so on, and that's an area that I've always sort of had a liking for or an interest in, and that was another little connection. And then he's also a translator. He translated poems from lots of different languages into Bulgarian, and so I started getting interested. But when I was reading the poems, I started reading them in Bulgarian. I thought, blimey, how am I going to go about translating those? I mean, they're rhythmically really unusual. They use, there he is. There is a picture of the man himself, he just kind of was quite a striking figure as well, because he was very badly wounded during the First World War, which is why his pictures after that period he always has his hair over his right eye, because he lost it. And in fact, you can see his glass eye in the House Museum in Stara Zagora, should you wish to. But yeah, so I started reading his work and thought, this is really, kind of going to be quite a challenge. And then, as these things are, lockdown happened around this time last year, and I thought, well, I better give myself a job, give myself something to do to keep myself occupied. So I thought, now is the time. Let's have a go at Milev, and so I started translating, in fact, a sequence of prose poems, which he wrote following his time on the Macedonian front in the First World War. In fact, another thing that intrigued me was that was the same front that the British artist Stanley Spencer served on, although obviously on the other side. And so there was this kind of, and I've written about Spencer too, so there was this kind of little connection there, although it turned out that Milev was wounded before Spencer got there. So there wasn't this kind of idea of these two amazing artists facing each other across the trenches, which was kind of intriguing. And so starting with prose poems because I kind of felt that would be a bit easier, and then I was rereading this poem Hell, which we're also going to talk about, and realized that well, one thing is that it was written in the same year that The Wasteland was published, that T.S. Eliot published The Wasteland, and there are kind of intriguing similarities between the two poems, both in terms of imagery, and both draw on Dante, and also the sort of rhythmic structure. So that was a kind of another starting point. So I suppose it was sort of a joy to discover this, major literary figure who was doing this really exciting, really quite different work. So I think if maybe Angel, could you sort of put him in a bit of the context of the Bulgarian literary scene, because I think people will find that interesting too.
Yes, thank you, Tom. Let me say first, you've been very brave, admiringly brave, because translating Gayo Milev is such a difficult task. I think both on the purely textual and the cultural, the systemic level. Milev occupies such a special place in our canon as both the leading avant-garde poet and a martyr to the political left. Since you just mentioned his glass eye, Gayo Milev actually disappeared in a wave of right-wing terror in 1925, and it was only when they found his glass eye about 25 years later that his tragic fate was confirmed. And he is very popular as far as poetry goes in Bulgaria. And certain lines of his have become catchphrases. And it's a real challenge, I think, to translate the Milev phenomenon into a culture which is not very much aware of his context. Then again, he's also textually difficult. I think because he's so hymnic, and because I am myself so much used to this hymnic quality, I hadn't realized that he can be difficult to understand, actually, at times. And often it is really the logic of sound that drives the verse forward and spawns outlandish images. And of course, it's precisely the sound, the phonic quality that is most difficult to translate in poetry into a foreign language. I've encouraged Tom, as I shall do once again, to try and find phonic equivalents, maybe not exactly rhymes, because I realize that this kind of rhyming that Gayo Milev uses is well, it has this jingling quality in the English in the English speakers here, especially today. But there are other things that a translator could do. I think alliteration could work. We've discussed that with Tom. Anyway, Gayo Milev is a special name in Bulgarian literature because of his tragic fate, because of his avant-garde quality, and because of his general aura of this extremely energetic, open, active, modern, and very European personality. He was very much in touch with avant-garde European movements, and he was always very, very keen to promote whatever he found to be new and modern and actual.
Yeah, if I can just jump in there for maybe a little more bio facts, which may or may not be relevant, but they might reappear in our discussion later. He was really in touch with Europe very personally, because after he studied a bit of Romance languages and literatures at Sofia, he went on to do more studies in Germany for a while, and then he went on to do work and kind of study English in the UK itself. So he's kind of very much a member of that kind of European avant-garde, and he lived it. And later on, it's kind of played out in his poems too.
At the very beginning of the First World War, actually, he happened to be in London, and he was arrested as a German spy, supposedly.
And he told me something too about once, I remember, Angel, where he wrote, didn't he write to his father? And he said, I sort of read some English poetry, but it's just rubbish.
Yes, well, that's, I guess, a specific moment when he wasn't really up to date. He was very much into classic English literature, and he knew very well German expressionism, Italian futurism, Russian avant-garde poetry. But somehow, even though he went to London at that period, he didn't happen to read Pound or Eliot or Wyndham Lewis or D.H. Lawrence. We could only be sorry he didn't.
Yeah, that would have been very interesting, I think. And you know, that's another sort of, now you've mentioned that kind of European connection. That's a sort of another layer of the thing which really attracts me to his work, is that, you know, he's obviously plainly you know, an important figure in European modernism as a whole. And you know, the understanding of modernism in the UK, at least when, you know, when I was there, is sort of more skewed towards the UK and USA kind of access to Pound and Eliot and so on. And obviously they were also, Pound certainly was European, you know, is a European figure too, but there strikes me that there are different strands in modernism which Milev connects up with, which perhaps in ways that are different from, let's say, the sort of UK-based modernists, as it were.
Should we give a taste of his
poetry?
Shall
we? Well, I tell you what, shall I read the translation first, or should you read the translation? I don't know. Okay.
As you say.
Perhaps if I, perhaps shall I read the translation and then you read the original? Shall we try that? Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to read. I'm not going to read the whole of the poem Hell for two reasons. One is it's quite long. And the other one is that, very interestingly, because Milev was, as I said, mentioned, was as a visual artist, also is very, you know, took his layout of his poems very seriously. And shortly after the end of the passage I'm going to read, the poem actually consists, there's a whole page of the poem which consists of the letter R running down the sort of side of the page. So we're going to avoid that little bit. So because I have no idea what that would sound like. But this poem, as I said, was is one of his major poems, and was written in 1922, and hopefully gives you an idea of some of his kind of style. So here is my translation. Hell. Beginning of the poem. 1. Abandon here all hope, Dante once wrote over Hell's Gate. Dante was andante, unpicking wise prophetic threads from world history, all of it, ancient and modern. Dante was andante, terror and fear sounds hope. We are presto, A gallop, one jump ahead of the second, a wretched salto mortale of every sin, spirit and flesh cut cruelly with poison. We are born in hell, already there. Unlike Dante, we've not come from outside in a dream. Our life entire is there, brimstone and fire. 9 spirals, circle on circle, 9 circles of grief, torment, bondage every day. Endlessly turn in a 9-fold gyre, and days we reel shot from God's bow, there where we're born, in hell. My pen, wavering, wanes, powerless, pained before what now I must relate, the eternal, infernal horror of hell. Come to my aid, guide Virgil. 2. But Virgil's not breathed in years. Virgil's toothless slot smirks in a classical skull, 1,000 or so years old. Put in your bag a loaf of black bread, and with no righteous polished tercets go on alone, O soul. Through the circles of hell, darkness, fire. Alas, Virgil's a lie. 3. Dark powers, deep powers, there, force, moral powers, mortal powers, flare, more. Curses muttering, and through the torment gleams a righteous faith in peace. A gnashing of teeth, the howls, the grief, wrath and hope unceasing. Oh, hell has no sinners, there the righteous suffer alone. Victims of murderous force, locked in 1,000-armed horrors of hunger and law. The endless human groan in swamps that seethe with bad blood and pitch, the moor's raging vortex. Hell is only for us. Right. So that's the kind of first half, really, in my rendition. But now Angel will read us the Bulgarian original.
Ад. Начало на поемата. Оставете тук всяка надежда, писани авга ръката на Данте над вратата на ада. Данте беше анданте и разнищваше мъдра пророческа прежда през цялата древна и нова световна история. Данте беше анданте, страх и терор без надежда. Ние сме престо, галоп, първия скок изпреварен от втория. Злочесто салто мортале на вси грехове раздрали жестоко с отрова плътта и душата. Ние се раждаме в ада, готово, там. Ние не идем отвън, като Данте през сън. Живота ни цял е там, жупел и плам. 9 спирали, кръг подир кръг, 9 кръга от мъка, от плен и огнетение всеки ден, без спир се въртят в деветорно въртение. И ние носим се шеметно, изстрел от Божия лък, там, дето ние сме родени, пада. Перото ми трепетно страда, отпада без мощ пред всегдашния страшния ужас на ада, който трябва аз днес да опиша. На помощ, вожд Виргилий. Но Виргилий отдавна не диша. Виргилий се хили с беззъбата зев на класически череп, стар 1000 и толкова с години. Сви в турбата си чер хлеб и без целомъдри спокойни търцини тръгвай сама, о душа, през адските кръгове, плами тъма. Уви, лъжа е Виргилий. Черните сили, подземните сили, там власт, верните сили, земните сили в клам, паст. Ропоти клетви и в мъката светва праведна вяра за мир. Скърцане зъби, вопли и скърби, гняв и надежда без спир. О, грешници няма в ада, там страдат белите праведни само, жертва на гибелна власт, приклещени в ужаса хилядорък на глад и закон, на човечеството безконечния стон, сред кипящи блата от вражда и смола, в огнена вихрена пас. Адът е само за нас.
Thank you. Thanks, Angel. Great. Yeah, so I hope that kind of gives you a flavour of both what it sounds like in Bulgarian and sort of my attempts to kind of replicate, or not really even replicate. I think when I've been translating poems, I kind of this sort of the idea is more like equivalence, you know, because you know you can't create the same sounds, obviously, exactly, but you can kind of hopefully produce what I would call, I suppose, an equivalent reading experience. maybe is the way to think about it. And then you try to sort of, I suppose it's a way of getting around that problem of, you know, like you mentioned, Angel, actually the jingly rhyme problem that can happen, or you end up trying to replicate a kind of sound structure, and that just you end up distorting the text.
But the rhythm is there. I think you definitely got his rhythm.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I was kind of really trying to, you know, hear it and try and hear it in the English and trying, because also his rhythmic structures are unusual. You know, they're not ones that are used regularly in English. So I can't even do that kind of translator's trick of going, this sounds a bit like, you know, someone. I go, oh, I know, I'll just write it as a poem, you know, like that, because the way that he patterns the rhythm is quite different. But I mean, that's where, you know, that's, I think, where our discussions, the three of us, were focused most on the kind of sound. And in fact, I wonder, shall I, that little bit at the beginning of part 3 of how about the deep powers, dark powers and everything, I actually, I think on these slides, and it might help if I actually share them, you can see how I've had, you know, made different attempts at kind of adjusting the meanings and everything according to the sound. So that's what the original text actually looks like, as you can see. So again, Milev writes in very short lines, which actually is curiously quite makes life more difficult as a translator in a strange sort of way. But you can see how they're, you know, the lines are laid out. And I think I've got my first attempt, and it's kind of really different actually from what it ended up as. And you know, there's these two words, forces and power. I was obviously not really quite sure what to do about them, and which order they should go in, and also about whether getting the rhymes on Vlasta and so on, how that was going to work. And I think this is probably the first version that you both saw, and sort of made notes at the side, sort of saying, it doesn't really sound like that. You were absolutely right. You know,
the formalist who wanted at least a bit of rhyme. So I was like, maybe entire should go in there to rhyme later on. Well, we might see that later.
I think that's coming. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was also, I mean, it's kind of interesting how little idea, actually, you know, how sort of just trying to get around that. And then I kind of went to this, I think. Here we go. Now I've worked out it's actually going to be better to have powers as the kind of main noun in this early part, and then you just leave force somewhere else and kind of, so that was all right. But then I was being a bit cocky, I think, with earthly powers, because that's actually, because that's a reference to a novel by Anthony Burgess. So, it was kind of suggesting itself, I suppose, but it's still not, again, you know, it's still not really, I wasn't really happy with that. And again, you came back to me, I think, both of you and Kate, and said, give it another go. So, and then there were about 3 or 4 or 5 more variations, if I remember, of me kind of trying to, it felt like it was a bit like doing a sort of jigsaw puzzle. It was kind of like rearranging the words in different orders and seeing what came out. And then I think actually, Angel, you did suggest thinking about alliteration at this point.
I did.
Yeah, and that was the crucial hint, you know, that was the crucial suggestion, because that's how it ended up, you know, ending up with quite a bit of, it's completely alliterative, really. So yeah, that was you know, that's a really small section, but you know, I think it just illustrates the sort of the way the working together with you, how it developed. And you know, you can see that there's actually a lot of changes in the way that passage in particular ended up. And you know, actually, by collaborating, I was able to actually come up with things that I wouldn't have normally thought of, and you know, and how to actually get to that kind of, that sort of the sound sense of the poem, you know, as much as it's kind of actually what does it mean, which I think with Milev, you know, with Milev is perhaps well, it's important in all poetry, but it's sort of especially sharp in the way that he writes, I think. So that, yeah, that's sort of, that's an illustration of how many drafts there were. There are actually about another 5 in between. So yeah, so it's kind of like, and you know, and the same, you know, and the same is true now. Looking at some of his other poems, which I have been doing, like September, which is this very long epic poem about the uprising against the right-wing coup here in the 1920s. You know, having sort of translated Hell, it's kind of, I think I understand the way that he's doing rhythm more, and it's kind of helped with that. But then there are also, you know, but you mentioned that's like kind of hymnic quality angle, and I think that's one of the things that I find hardest with some of the other poems is this, you know, trying to make that work in another culture. You know, it's not just another language. It's the
absolutely. It's a very different tradition and a very different kind of modernism.
Mm. Yeah, again, you know, there's sort of again, there's no sort of easy fallback for an English translator to kind of go, ah, this reminds me of something else, you know. And he's also one of these poets that I really like and admire, who, when they sit down to write, it's almost as if they start from you know, a tabula rasa, from right at the beginning. Each poem is different, and it has its kind of different feel to it and a different structure. You know, I'm thinking now about sequence, you know, the idols sleeping, and you know, that the way that he kind of rewrites or uses, sorry, traditional folk song, and then kind of creates these kind of effectively, essentially modernist poems out as a result of those.
Yes, of course, you can recognize the common approach, but I very much agree that each individual poem is different and should be treated in its own individual way by the translator. Because translation, anyways, is always a matter of selection, combination, and a translator is in poetry, especially, needs to select what he or she deems really the most important thing.
Yeah. Wait. Oh no,
Yeah, we're back.
Yeah, we're back. Yeah, no, sorry, phrase or something. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that's it, isn't it? You sort of have to. I've certainly found with Miller's work is you know, sort of complete one poem and then go, okay, now I've just got to rethink my entire strategy because this poem is now, you know, has a completely different kind of rhythmic and sonic structure and what have you, and in a way it's you know, perhaps it's that appeals to me as well. You know, it's like, you know, it's it is that having to sort of rethink and come up with a new strategy each time that I find very, very interesting. And I'm sure that, you know, it will well, I know, or that I've encountered poems which I just think, no, I don't think I'm going to be able to manage this. It's just not going to work in English, or it's going to involve too much of that kind of distortion to make it have any kind of bear any resemblance to the original.
Yes. Well, you could never know if something works unless you've tried.
Indeed. Well, yeah. So I'm keeping trying. So that's the main thing. And and what's great actually, I'll just mention this now and then perhaps talk about the little prose poems as well, is that we are getting, as Milena said at the beginning, there's interest now in publishing this work. And, so Racine magazine has published Hell and the Durand Lake prose poems, along with a short poem called My Head. And then also the High Window online journal is going to publish a selection. I'm not quite sure what yet exactly, although I think it will be from Idle, and I think it will be part of September fairly soon. So it's kind of, and I've had interest from people about possibly a book as well. So that's really great because, I think he's an important figure, and it's good that I hope more people will read his work, be able to read his work in the Anglophone world, and perhaps find out more about Bulgarian poetry and literature in general. That's part of that.
The Anglo-Saxon world and beyond, because of course a lot of people all over the globe could read the Milev in English,
sure,
which they couldn't do in Bulgarian.
Yeah. So the reception is encouraging. I think people are seem to be genuinely interested, which is really great. So I think, yes, perhaps what we should do now is we'll read another little selection. So these are these prose poems. Milev wrote a lot of prose poems actually. Quite a large bulk of his work is prose poetry, and one of the first that I really encountered is this sequence that he wrote about being stationed at Durand Lake during the First World War in what is now Northern Macedonia. And it was really interesting for me to read, we obviously being familiar with First World War poetry, certainly if you're educated in the UK, you have a good understanding of First World War poetry, usually at school. So it was very interesting to me to read a different perspective, and writing in a different perspective about the First World War, and on a, not the Western front, on the Macedonian front. And as I say, there was this connection potentially with Stanley Spencer, which I found, really fascinating. And it's also it's actually a very beautifully written sequence. It's odd in that way, it's not celebrating war in any way, shape, or form, as you'll see, but as a piece of literary text, this is very rich and has some very interesting references and so on in it. So I'm just going to read two short prose poems, and then Bozhil is going to read the Bulgarian originals, and true to form, we're going to read parts 4 and 5. There's about 16 parts in total.
Yeah, exactly. And then here, actually, we can also see, before Tom does the reading, it's kind of the bio notes that we mentioned are quite clearly reflected in those texts, because he does have mention of, say, German art and culture in the original, a bit of Latin to end one of them with, and also him speaking to the Scotsman. He, I think, had been back from the UK maybe 3 or 4 years at that stage. So he gets asked to speak to a captured Scottish soldier. Yeah. So see all that. So it's kind of reflected in that text.
And also, I should say, this is a kind of bonus because I assume for reasons of space, Racine actually left out a couple of the Do-Ram poem. So you're there, including number 4. So you get, this is a rare and exclusive manifestation of this part of the poem, quite early part. Now, true to form, I should perhaps say at the beginning that part 4 actually starts with 3 lines of, well, they're like my underlining lines. So it's like something's missing. Yes, please. Yeah. Oh, I can't. Yeah, there we are. So this is what it looks like textually. It begins with, I suppose, almost like it suggests silence, or it suggests something that's been anyway, removed. So here we go from Dorian Drake. A Scotsman from the Black Watch. A third is brought in wounded to the infirmary. They call me in to question him, but he's almost unconscious. Tall and spare, he lies on the stretcher with a broken leg and a hole in his head. Unhappy son of the Highlands, whose father was a pure-in-heart shepherd with ringing green tartan bagpipes. But his son became a soldier and came here to hurl bombs. But maybe now in his native Highlands, with bonny white flocks scattered across them, glint in his darkening consciousness, than the terrifying Bulgarians who supposedly eat people, and again, the half of a Scottish croft. Maybe now he remembers that old Scottish song, My Heart's in the Heart. And so, number 5 is, a strange, eerie feeling takes hold of you when you go up to the front line under the veil of night in the whistling of shells. Not fear, something deeper than fear. You feel a kind of powerlessness grip you, choking your mind and soul in its embrace. It's a moment that lasts long. You feel that you're alone, that you're cut off, that you neither can nor should remember anything. Not your old thoughts, not the long ago smiles of women far away, not the books you've read. You're in the grip of this night lit up with burning steel, a night, and the feeling's overwhelming. That's the first night. Oh, the renaming of every idol, every desire, a radiant crucifix, an oblivion of fabulous diadems dyed with bloody stains. You forget those walking beside you. You're alone. Otherworldly and alien to yourself. Suddenly imagine you're that stern, silent and unknown knight by Jura, astride a horse, followed by an ugly procession of death and the devil, single-horned and farcical. That dark medieval engraving, Ritter, Tod and Teufel. Then suddenly 4 deadly shells scream overhead and we instinctively sprawl among the stones and thorns beside us. And again, the superhuman weight of an isolated consciousness falls on your soul. Pro patria. Right, so now Bozhil will read that in Bulgarian.
Номер 4. Шотландец от черната гвардия. Третият един е донесен ранен при лазарета. Викат ме да го разпитам, но той е почти в безсъзнание. Висок и сух, той лежи с счупен крак и пробита глава върху носилката. Нещастен син на планините, чийто баща е бил чистосърдечен овчар, съзвучна, облечена в зелено кайда. Синът обаче е станал войник и е дошъл тук да хвърля бомби. Но може би сега и той, когато в потъмнялото му съзнание се мяркат ту родните планини с хубави бели стада, разпръснати по тях, ту страшни българи, които ядели хора, и пак огнището в една шотландска колиба. Сега може би той си спомня онази стара шотландска песен «Сърцето ми е в планините», песента на Бърнса. Сега номер 5. Едно странно и тайнствено чувство те обхваща, когато под полута на нощта и свиренето на гранатите се приближаваш към бойната линия. Не страх, нещо по-дълбоко от страха. Чувствуваш как някакво си безсилие стиска и задавя в прегръдките си твоето съзнание и душата ти. То е един момент, който трае дълго. Ти чувствуваш, че си сам и че си откъснат, че не можеш и не трябва да си спомняш нищо. Нито старите твои мисли, нито някогашните усмивки на отдалечени жени, нито книгите, които си чел. Ти си във властта на тази огряна от горящи железа нощ, която, ти го чувстваш повелително, е първа нощ. О, прекращение на всичките кумири и желания, разпятие на блясъците и забвение на приказните диадеми, обагрени с кървави петна. Ти забравиш уния, които вървят заедно с тебе. Ти си един. Много мистичен и много чужд самия себе си. Ненадейно си въобразяваш, че си ония строгият, мълчащият и нечуващият рицар на дюрера, яхнал на кон, след когото грозно стъпват смъртта и дяволът. Еднорог и смешен. Унази тъмна средновековна гравюра, Рита Тот und Teufel. Тогава внезапно над нас изпищяват 4 трагични гранати и ние неволно лягаме за камъните и тръните, до които сме. И пак върху душата ти пада свръхчовешката тежест на едно самотно съзнание, пропатрия.
Thank you. Great. Yeah, so there you can see, I mean, I found that again, you know, there's an interesting thing, isn't it? You know, he uses that same reference to Horace as Wilfred Owen famously does in his First World War poem, Dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori, and that, and the reference to Jura as he mentioned and things. And, you know, I think as a translator, you kind of, I suppose perhaps rather mistakenly assume that prose poetry is going to be easier to translate. But there are so many kind of references.
And some linguistic traps here as well, which kind of remembered. Say, for example, Yadeli Chora to a non-native learner of Bulgarian would look like a past tense form. And Tom had 8 people in the first translation, but actually this form in Bulgarian expresses some doubts, and we then had to change it who supposedly eat people. So can people say reportedly, so that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Was the nitty-gritty linguistic bits which we had to, you know, get to grips with, or the painting that's described. There were 3 people there, like death, devil, the night, death, and the devil. And then it says in Bulgarian, "Ednorok is smeshen," and Ednorok could mean a unicorn, or it could be one horned, an adjective. And smeshen is definitely an adjective, but I think in the original we had the first draft, there was something like a unicorn and farce. But then that wouldn't have worked because it would have introduced more, you know, figures in the actual picture than there were. So we then had to think about that. So there were lots of traps, even though it's kind of deceptively simple, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, the Edin Rog was particularly baffling.
Yeah, there were lots of pitfalls.
I was kind of looking through the, you know, Jura's etching and just trying to think, well, is there a unicorn hidden somewhere that I can't see?
Yeah, I remember talking about these things.
Yeah. So you end up doing these kind of, and that's part of the, I mean, sort of go around, you know, a bit full circle in a way to what Milena was saying at the beginning about the sort of literary adventure side of it. You know, sort of been saying he's really difficult and kind of, well, yes, he is, and he poses a lot of challenges, but in a way, that's kind of the essence of the adventure. Yeah, certainly for me, and then it's finding these connections, and you know, when both of you have kind of pointed stuff out to me, you know, about these kind of connections with his work and what he's actually referring to or alluding to, and really, you know, that whole side of it is fascinating too, I think.
Yeah, more kind of linguistically kind of nitty-gritty bits. I remember talking about how do we end this, because I think originally Tom had first person I, so my soul feels such and such. Do we go for that, or do we keep your soul and make kind of more universal you, so that those are the soldiers, those are people across, you know, the trenches as well. So you as a universal participant. So that was also something we had to, you know, think about a little bit and talk about.
Yeah. No, I mean, and there are numerous examples of that, and it's kind of, you know, and that, I suppose that's one of the challenges is like, okay, there's a linguistic choice that I can make here, which actually has the kind of right nuances and connotations. But if I choose that one, it messes up something else. You know, it's like, it's a really quite delicate balancing act.
Yeah. For example, I think for, what was it? Like Visoki Such. Originally we had high and dry, but that would have given you completely different meaning in English, like stranded, something like soul and dry, like to refer to the person. So then
you're into an idiom.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's the but you see, I saw the sock and soup together, and I just thought, oh, high and dry,
yeah.
made for it. Yeah, so
It's
there's that kind
fun
of,
to talk about it.
yeah. That's the other thing, you know. I you know, it's what's so great about collaborating is to kind of have these slightly, sometimes incredibly, slightly bizarre conversations about what different. What all the potential meanings of something could be.
Well, I was definitely the odd one out, being a non-literature person, and you guys had to deal with the literature side of it. I was like the linguistic nitty-gritty, boring grammar type thing. Yeah.
Well, I compiled my team with great K.
I think you're an incognito literature person, Bozhil.
Maybe, yeah, I guess, yeah. Vicariously only, yes.
You definitely commented on some of the literary stuff too, just as Angel commented on the linguistic stuff.
Yeah, of course.
It was, yeah, you know, it's, but I think that, yeah, it's, again, that's what I mean about a kind of balance in the whole process of translation, I think, especially, you know, with poetry. And kind of, it would be very easy, it's extraordinarily easy for me to miss things. You know, sort of sound-wise and meaning or allusions or all stuff, really. Okay, shall we perhaps go to Q&A, or unless anyone wants to say anything?
So there is a Tom, there is a comment in the chat. I don't know if you can see it, and if you want to start.
Okay.
It should be accessible to everybody, but maybe we can read it out loud.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, it's a sort of comment about unconventional rhymes in Bulgarian. So, yeah. And saying that, yeah, pointing out that the rhyming is often irregular and surprising and often in the middle of the line. Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah, I mean, being aware of that, that possibility is kind of part of the, I think, part of the job, actually.
Yeah, and actually, you talk about rhymes sometimes just as a way to deal with that. And at some stages, we did a little bit. I say, if we read a bit of the original draft, for example, here of the very first stanza, where there's a little bit of rhyme in Bulgarian, and Tom's original translation was something like, "We are born in hell already there. Unlike Dante, we've not come from outside in a dream. Our whole life is there, brimstone and fire." And here I was like, we can do a little bit of rhyme. And I think in the final published translation, it has something like, "Our life entire is there, brimstone and fire," or something along those lines. So there was a little bit of rhyme that we did try to recreate, or Tom did later rather, but without doing it every single time, so that it doesn't sound jingly and unnatural. So maybe we've done it, or he's done it a couple of times, but not too much kind of consciously.
Gayo Milev rhymes exuberantly, and it is just a whole different tradition, really. Rhyming is so common to Bulgarian lyrical poetry, and especially full melodic rhyming. You don't really get this kind of rhyming very much in English poetry after, let's say, T.S. Eliot, maybe. So I agree that to the ear of today's English speaker, this kind of rhyme would probably, and this persistent rhyming, this pattern of rhyming would be a little bit awkward, I guess. So yes, maybe occasional rhyming would actually do a better job.
Yeah. I suppose my approach, or my sort of theoretical thinking about this is that the problem usually arises when it involves some kind of horrible distortion in English. Not necessarily the meaning, but even just the word order or something. So, you know, like, yeah, entire and fire kind of just were, they self-suggested them themselves, as it were. And then that bit with that we were looking at, you know, there's, and I think what I tried to do actually in the case of Hell was I was quite aware of the possibilities for half rhyming, you know, as a kind of option. So that actually, I think there are quite a few examples of where I put a half rhyme in as a way of sort of getting around.
And there's a further possible parallel with Wilfred Owen. I think Owen's rhyming, the pararhymes, the consonant rhymes, would be an interesting approach to explore.
I think that became increasing. You know, I became increasingly conscious of that as a possibility while I was working on some of these poems, and it seems like sometimes it's a very good way of getting a sense of the rhyme, but without having to, like I say, sort of get a bit out of, you know, pull a line out of nowhere, or just add one in because it will run, you know, or whatever. I don't know.
So as we are getting more questions, Angel, can I ask you one more time to show the book you read from? Because
Sure.
got this request from the audience, and I couldn't find the link online to this exact edition. So who is the publisher? Can you tell us the year?
Hristov, publisher Hristov, 1995.
Okay. Do you want to show your kind of Tom's edition is maybe a bit more recent?
It's a very interesting edition. It's 2 volumes in one. There we go.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is the poetry, journalism, essays, translations as well, and this volume includes his artwork.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much. And maybe you can stay in the Q&A, and you can maybe start from the first question. We have time actually, which is good.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, let's start with do I have to press anything, Milena, or can I just talk?
Oh, yeah. Would you like to read the question, or shall I read it?
Sure. Yeah, so we have a question which is, Brodsky once said, poetry, after all, in itself is a translation, one of the aspects of the psyche rendered in language. To what degree do you think you found yourself donning the mantle of a poet while translating? Okay. Well, I actually am a poet as well, so I kind of, the mantle was already donned in that sense. But there's also I read came across another quote by Charles Sinitz, the Serbian poet who published in America a lot, and he was saying about getting it, you get into the shoes of another poet when you're translating them, and I suppose that would, yeah. So I don't know about whether I really could say I stepped into Milev's shoes, but I suppose because I do write my own poetry, it kind of helps, you know. not just on the technical side, but you're sort of, I'm aware of the kind of tradition and conventions and things. So that definitely does help. Okay, now there's also a question from here from Angela Riddell saying, okay, can you talk about your method? Okay, do you audio record the text in Bulgarian since the sound is so crucial? Do you do a straight up literal translation first and then move towards other levels of the text, phonetics, cultural, etc.? Okay, yeah, I mean, to sort of just maybe describe the process, I don't actually use audio recordings, which actually perhaps I should. Might be quite a good idea. But I don't know, sometimes I mean, I'm kind of trying to hear the text in my head, obviously, as much as I possibly can. And then, yeah, the process really is kind of, I tend to do a completely straight literal translation, you know, just get the words down and say, right, this is roughly what it's about. And then, and what the key images are, but also what the kind of structure of the overall poem is. You know, how does it move from one set of images or thoughts or whatever, how do they all link up? So I kind of, once I've got a literal translation, I guess that's where I would go next. And then it's a case of going up through all these other levels of it. And I suppose in Milev's case, it has been a lot of references to cultural and historical context. You know, what's the context of him writing this poem, Hell? Well, you know, so you know, so reading some more about what Bulgaria was like in 1921, 1922, and all those kind of things. But yeah, I don't know whether it's quite. I'm probably making it sound a lot more sort of organised and rational than the real experience is. But that, that would be how I think sort of ideally I would do it, is kind of get a literal translation, then look at it structurally, you know, sort of with that mantle of the poet on, as it were, and then kind of focusing on more and more specific textual details later. Okay, and we also have a question saying it might be hard to choose, but still, what do you find the most difficult part of translating Gayo Milev? Okay, it is hard to choose. No, I think for me personally, it's the sound side of it. It's the rhythm and the sound, and you know, as Angel pointed out, both Angel and Bozhil pointed out, you know, those aspects are so important to his work, and you know, you can't really avoid them. And that, of course, is when languages, you know, the sounds of words in different languages even obviously don't necessarily meet up, but when they do, that's great. You think, wow, hurrah! But you know, they don't. So yeah, that's what takes. That's what takes. That would get my vote for the most difficult or challenging part. You know. Okay, all right. So okay, and Joe is asking, how do you approach something like September when there's an existing translation into English? Did you go and read Peter Tempest's translation and notice what seemed to be out of date, or did you approach it first with fresh eyes and ears? No, I haven't answered that already. That is an interesting one, because you know, it had, well, I had read it before I'd even started translating Milev, so I was aware of its existence. And so then I went back and read it again when I thought about translating it, because I wanted to, because I wanted to see if it was justified to actually write a new translation of it. And I have to admit, I felt it was, for a number of reasons, some of which were to do with this kind of, the distortion problem, in terms of the kind of, I felt that there were things that I thought, I think that there are different approaches here. So it was very useful to have it to look at and just see. And there are obviously lines which are actually identical. Actually, not that many, as it turns out. But it is a different. It's interesting that there was this translation, and to have that, like as I say, is sort of around. I didn't feel that feeling, which I think some people have. Like how many people have translated Dante? Dozens of people over the years, and I think every time someone new approaches the Divine Comedy, they have to put their mark on it, and so or make it, or take a different approach, which is fine, absolutely. But I didn't feel that so much with September, because I just thought if I just go and take the same approach that I've taken with Hell, I think I will produce a translation that's appropriately different anyway. Okay. Okay. Chris is asking about Angel, about your comment or a description of him as a martyr to the political left. And is that just because of the poem September, or was there more to his martyrdom?
Well, basically, there was a series of left-wing and right-wing retaliations at the time, and waves of left-wing uprisings and terrorist acts, and state-sponsored right-wing terror. So Gayo Milev actually got caught up in a mass wave of right-wing terror when a lot of people disappeared. A wave of terror which was specifically targeting left-wing activists and intellectuals. So he was one of those left-wing intellectuals who were presumed too dangerous for the state. It was not only because of the September poem. He actually met a group of British Labour MPs and discussed with them the political situation in Bulgaria. And that was probably a very dangerous thing to do at the time. If you're interested, I would once again strongly recommend the novel that Milena mentioned at the beginning, The Same Night Awaits Us All, by Hristov, published by Open Letter. It's very much a novel about Gayo Milev, and it contains a lot of historical and biographical information.
Great, thanks, Angel. Okay, here's a good question. I think that should be for all of us. If Gayo Milev was in this web room, what would you ask him or tell him? I'd say don't go to the police station if they ask you. Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that, I'd ask him all sorts of really small technical questions, like, what did you mean by that?
Yeah, that's actually what I do as well, because I actually was lucky enough to translate some of Tom's own poetry into Bulgarian. It was such luxury, and I felt so lucky and privileged to actually have access to the author. And I remember after my first drafts, we went through all the lines one by one. I was like, did you have that alliteration in mind when you were writing it? Is it there intentionally, or is it just an accident? Did you mean this or that here? And you can't do that with authors. You can't really have access to it. So I just go through him, through all the lines with him, essentially.
Yeah. I think that's very true, and you know, it's been very helpful for me the other way around, translating Bulgarian poets who are alive. You can actually.
I would have an experiment and ask him to read The Wasteland.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Indeed, T.S. Eliot and Gayo Milev are very different, but there are certain parallels between Hell, especially Hell, and The Wasteland. I wrote an academic article on that. So yes, I would love to know what Gayo Milev would think about The Wasteland.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Certainly struck me that those sort of similarities. Okay, and then so we also have a question, I guess, to me, which is: did you keep all of the rhymes, even the more hidden ones, or were you more liberal? Was there a moment when you would put not so proper words only to keep the rhyming? I think the answer to that, my honest answer to that is, well, certainly the second part of the question is no. I try not to anyway. Certainly, you know, with that little passage I showed the variations from. I mean, hopefully, I think I've sort of managed to get there through this idea of alliteration and some half rhymes in that little passage, sort of eventually, but simply by sort of looking at all the possible, really, frankly, synonyms for these words and possible meanings, and then kind of finding. It's almost like a Venn diagram. You know, you kind of put all the meanings in Bulgaria in the left, and all the possible meanings in English on the right, and then hopefully somewhere in the middle you can find something like that. So I don't know. It is difficult to make decisions, but I think it's a. If I was telling my translation students only the other way, I think it's I don't think that translation has rules. I think it has responsibilities, which is a slightly different kind of category of consideration. The main responsibility in this case is to the text. It's also to the author, but also to the culture, you know, the source culture. So I think almost always things have to be on a case-by-case basis, and you kind of think, okay, if I actually pursue the rhyming here as main criteria for the way this line sounds, I'm going to mess it up in some other way. Maybe that's the criteria. Okay, and in the final phase of the translation, do you set aside the original and work solely on the English? Not in the final phase, actually, Christopher. That tends to happen in about draft 2. Or maybe you're about 3 or 4 drafts down the line, where the kind of, you know, the really literal translation is starting to form up into something which actually resembles a poem. And then I probably will close the original text for a while and have a look at it as in terms of the sound and the rhythm and the meaning and so on in English. So there is a kind of phase of not looking at the original, and then actually in the final phases when I do go back to the original and really examine it again and say, oh, what have I missed or whatever, or in this case I rely on Angel and Bozhil to tell me what I've missed, which has been very helpful. So I would say that's the kind of process. What advice would you give translation students? Well, I'm just spending 10 weeks giving advice to translation students, so this answer could go on for quite some time if I was to give it. But I mean, I think the thing is to become familiar with other people's translations and see how they approach it. You know, I learned quite a lot from reading Robert Lowell's Imitations, which basically made me think I don't want to translate poetry like Robert Lowell. Because, you know, he famously kind of basically just takes the gist of the poem and turns it into his own poem. So I didn't really want to, so I learned a lot from that. And reading widely around, you know, I haven't just read Gayo Milev, you know, I've read around even work that I probably won't translate or decide to translate myself to understand the content. Okay, right. Okay, so Yana, hello Yana, you're asking about why Milev, and how, and can I elaborate more on how I choose poets to translate? And you'd like to hear another bit, okay. That's very kind of you. Yeah, I mean, Milev was, you know, as I say, it was kind of a lot. I think a lot of it is down to kind of personal experience and feeling about it, about his work, and this kind of this thing about his interest in German expressionism, his as a figure of European modernism, you know, that and so on, and then I think more importantly was that I actually started to read his work and then kind of could see that, you know, I could see its important work in terms of what he's doing as a poet. But I also kind of, and it's also the kind of work I'm interested in, not necessarily that I write myself, but in terms of reading. So I think that was another factor. And it does, in the end, I think you kind of, poetry in particular, I tend to find that kind of, I read work and then and I get some kind of almost instinctive feeling that this is a sort of, I'm going to be okay doing this. You know, my worst nightmare is someone phoning me up, phoning me up. How old am I? Sending me an email saying, you know, could you translate an anthology of 20th century Bulgarian poetry? Because, you know, it would be like, there's so many different poets, and I have that kind of feeling of A, interest, and B, a kind of, I guess it's a kind of empathy for it. So, yeah. Okay.
But I think we'd be happy if you received such a call. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah. Well, you never know. But yeah, I might have to enlist some help. Well, I know I can. So it's fine. So anyone out there, here's your chance. Okay. So maybe we should. We've got some more questions. See how we're going for time about reading another one, but. So we have this other question. What is your attitude to an external editor looking and or working on your translation after you think they're absolutely done? That's to all of us.
Are they ever absolutely done? That's the thing.
Well, that's a very good, that's a good point. Yes, I think probably that they never are absolutely done.
Another reader is always welcome, and their feedback, I think, is always appreciated.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, the editors who have published or are going to publish these particular translations have not really. I think I noticed. I think, well, yeah, but as I mentioned in Racine, there's a couple of the prose poems were left out for space reasons. But I mean, that's kind of that happens. And in fact, when I've been working on other, you know, prose translations, having an editor to work with has been great. It's actually been really useful. You know, my claim to fame of translating Hristov Stoichkov's autobiography was, you know, made remarkably easier by having an native English speaking editor who didn't speak Bulgarian but knew a lot about football, you know. So actually, helped me a lot.
So if I may jump in briefly, Tom, you've been lucky then. Do you consider yourself lucky with the editors you've been working? Because from my modest experience with the US publishers and UK publishers, we published 2 Bulgarian novels through UK publishers, and actually in one of the cases, it was a novel and there were poems, and the publisher requested that the author cuts the poems. And in the US, very often, the editor is the communicator with the reader. There is always this imagined reader, and they always make changes for the sake of that imagined reader understand this imagined market as well. So maybe because it's poetry. It's interesting. I was actually going to ask you a silly question in that regard. That also has to do a little bit with cultural realias that Angela mentioned in the very beginning. I noticed that when you were reading Грешници няма фада, там страдат белите праведни само, you omitted white in your English translation, and it's a silly comment, I know, because I'm Bulgarian and I know that white is a connotation of innocence, and that Gayo Milev referred to the working class hero that was white because was innocent and victimized and so on and so forth. But this also maybe has relevance with the current context we live in with political identity. So, and has to do with the editor. Yeah, I was thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, those are factors. And I mean, it's kind of, I know that, you know, there have been cases where publishers and editors have turned down books of poetry and translation because the poems didn't really fit with what was fashionable, you know, or they sounded too much like foreign poetry. I mean, this is quite a long time ago, I should say. But, you know, that's a weird attitude. You know, so the translators were basically told, go away and make this sound more like English poetry, which seems to be kind of defeating the object. You know, the translations need to work in English. You know, if that's obvious, but they don't. You know, they shouldn't be, you know, an English poem. That's kind of cultural imperialism. You know, but no. And to answer the first part of your question, I am very lucky. Most of the editors I work with are actually friends of mine, publishers. So, you know, I think I've made myself a nuisance in Britain as, you know, the bloke who translates Bulgarian poetry, and there's been a suspiciously large amount being published in specific journals, because they've been very, very supportive, and I'm extremely grateful for that. You know, it's great. Okay, so we've got a few more questions. Was there a line that stuck with you, something you memorized? Well, that's a good question. I'm absolutely hopeless at remembering poetry. It may sound like a strange thing for a poet and translator to say, but it is. There are many lines. This is a great cop-out answer, and we'll just have to say there are so many lines that stuck with me that I can't really, you know, pick one out. I am very fond of those kind of sound lines in a lot of people. You know, they kind of intrigue me, and I do carry them around in my head for quite a long time because I'm puzzling over them. Okay, and then also, what advice would you give about trying to preserve the alliteration and/or assonance when translating? Well, I think that goes back to my Venn diagram theory of putting all the possible Bulgarian meanings in one thing, and well, you know, particularly putting all the English possibilities for phrases and so on around, and then kind of seeing how. I mean, I don't have my own notebooks available, but you know, I do drawings quite often. So, you know, to get to that deep powers, dark powers bit, which has got both alliteration and assonance, actually, you know, that took writing down all the possible synonyms for dark and all the possible synonyms for deep, and then suddenly sort of like, you know, eureka, there they are, there the, you know, there's the alliteration, there's the assonance. So I think that's kind of how it works in practice, I would say. Okay, and then another, since you mentioned about which came first for you, poetry or translation? Well, I have to be absolutely honest and say poetry. I started writing poetry as a student, like many people do. And I didn't actually start learning Bulgarian until 6 or 7 years ago, when I kind of first made contact, as it were, with Bulgarian friends and so on. So,
have you not been translated from other languages?
No,
Oh.
no. I mean, I could have translated from French, I suppose, but for some reason, I mean, you know, French is very commonly translated into English, so it was the interest started with wanting to read Bulgarian literature, so sort of so purely selfish, practical reason, and then kind of it went from there, and so now I've become, you know, and once you start doing it, you become very interested in translation and become interested in the theory and different approaches and so on. So,
and you have something really unusual. So Tom, I remember when he was learning Bulgarian when we first met. So he, as kind of by way of practicing really his Bulgarian, he started writing poetry in this foreign language he was just learning and had taken up maybe a few years ago, or months even. And he then translated his own original Bulgarian poems into English, which was a really fun experience, and they got published in the bilingual edition, which was absolutely fantastic as an idea, I thought.
It was, yes, it was a bit, you know, it's one of those things, isn't it? Because I was a poet, like when you're learning a language, you have to write exercises. Normally you write in prose, say things. Anna went to the shop and she bought some vegetables. Anna bought a lettuce, you know, and I thought, well, okay, I can do that. Practicing my Bulgarian, I thought, well, why not just try writing something? And so some friends Bulgarian friends helped prep them, and then and so on, and then translating it was actually really revelatory. I'd written in Bulgarian completely different poems, but that's that's another story. But translating myself was quite an interesting one. That way round. I mean, no one believes me. They said, "Oh, who translates them to Bulgarian?" I said, "No one did. I wrote them in Bulgarian, then translated them in English." Bit of a unusual process, I suppose. Okay, fine.
We covered all questions. Oh no, just a moment. Let me see if you want to take one more. Question just popped up. Yeah.
Okay. Do you experience burnout with reading, writing, translating, or just work in general? If so, what is your usual remedy for it? Okay. Yeah. I don't know. Yes. Yeah, I think everyone has burnout. I don't know about Angel and Bozhil, but my usual remedy is kind of just to stop doing it for a while. Give yourself some time off.
You just sit and wait. Let's go.
Yeah. Yeah. Or go. Yeah. I mean, it's okay. So now we have a very specific question here. I can't help asking, how does Novata Zlovena Roba sound in translation? Okay. Find it. Is it in hell?
Isn't that
One of those
in
catchphrases.
September?
Oh, is it September?
I think Government was на робот файл September, isn't it?
Okay, I don't actually have that translation around. I can't remember what I did with it.
Let me actually have a look, but I think that's September.
Yeah. But I will send it to you, Yana, when I find it. Okay.
Yeah,
well,
that is September, as we suspected. Yeah, so
right.
we don't have it to hand right now.
oh, it's the second line, though, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
the
yeah,
second
yeah,
line is
yeah, yeah,
September.
yeah. Okay,
Do you
yes.
have it to hand? Yeah.
I can probably find it. Well, look, we have a question for all of us. So, as all of you have written either poetry, prose, or academic papers, so you're writers and/or poets in your own right, what do you fear might be lost if someone translates your work, and do you apply these fears while you translate? So, you two, I'll leave that one to you two, and while I find.
Good question. Indeed, I'm often afraid that a certain stylistic peculiarity that I've invested a lot in might be lost in translation, and sometimes it is, of course. But yes, I think because I recognize that fear, I myself try to be very careful when I translate somebody else's work, in order not to lose a certain stylistic feature that might be especially important.
Yeah, I think I'm a bit more pessimistic there after meeting up with Tom to discuss his poetry line by line. I did get a lot of it, like I don't know, it was a lot of alliteration, hidden meanings and things. A lot of it, however, I had completely lost. So if Tom hadn't told me as an author that he intended such and such a thing, which I completely missed, I wouldn't have got it. And I was like in complete despair, thinking, oh gosh, I can imagine what happens with authors. You'd never, ever be able to ask. So I wouldn't even think about it anymore. I was like, okay, as a translator, as Tom said, you have to be really responsible and do your best. But at the same time, you should be aware that you will never, ever be able to recreate the original 100%. Kind of that's my defeatist approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think my experience is fairly similar. You know, it's kind of, and it's been interesting because you know, working with people like Bozhil and translations of my own poems into Bulgarian has been really interesting because you do actually discover a lot about your own work that way.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, oh, yeah, okay, I'd forgotten that.
Yeah, we actually had moments where I was like, oh, that's an interesting thought that you had. Maybe I did mean that. So yeah, you have a point. So sometimes actually you'll translate, actually that's kind of more optimistic. So I was very pessimistic in my first initial reaction. But actually there's also an optimistic note to sound as well, because sometimes the translator might discover things that you maybe subconsciously invested in your text and you couldn't think about it, but it was there and they found it for you. So actually that's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, maybe should end on a positive note there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And going back to Jana's very
that experience with Angela, who's still around, I hope, and my German translator too. Indeed, sometimes translators discover things that you might have not noticed, or at least you haven't rationalized.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's it. Certainly, and it's also interesting when people come up with stuff that you just haven't thought of.
Yeah,
you know, like I have this poem called "Burning Omaha," which is a reference to the city in America and a Billy Bragg song from the 1980s, as it happens. But actually, that's been translated by two different people, Bozhil and Vladimir Levchev, and Vlado kind of said, "Hey, so this is all about Omaha Beach, is it? You know, the D-Day landings." And because it had fire and sand and stuff in the poem, it was a completely reasonable thing, but it changed the whole, you know, I was kind of thinking, I hadn't thought of that.
True, and actually not so much as a writer, but as a reader, I found myself, when I read something in order to translate it, like it enhances your reading experience so much that you start seeing things that you would have missed otherwise. Definitely. Great exercise in reading, translating is really amazing reading experience.
I will take two more questions and then we can probably.
Okay, yeah. I will just answer Jana's question about that line from September. Well, perhaps I better read. This is where it's at the moment. Okay, this is the opening 4 lines, probably the lines makes sense, of September. So I've got it as, at the moment, I hasten to add, night's fatal wound gives birth to the slay's unending wrath, a red rage unsurpassed. There we are. So that's its working kind of. So it's got some half rhymes, and I've gone for the kind of the hell strategy, as it were, at the moment. So see how that ends up. Okay, what do you enjoy most, translating prose or poetry? I think probably I don't necessarily have a preference. I mean, prose has its own challenges and its own. I mean, if you're talking about fiction, or prose fiction in particular, it has its same kind of challenges, but so I wouldn't. I mean, I've mostly translated poetry, I have to admit. In terms of prose fiction, I've translated a few short stories, although I have some plans in mind, longer projects. Yeah, so today, I mean, yeah, I would say it would be pretty much equivalent. And then finally, interesting. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, Chris was asking me, how much do you think about the reader? How do you picture her or him or her? Yeah, I suppose I should really think about the reader quite a lot, really. And I think I do, because I think that comes from my own writing my own work. And I kind of have, I don't know whether I could ever say how I picture them, but I mean, I kind of always have the reader in mind. And I think that's very important, because I think that, I mentioned earlier about translators having responsibilities, the text and the author and the culture. But I think also we have responsibilities to the reader, which I think is what you're touching on there. And, we need to, so whilst I don't perhaps kind of picture them as a specific individual, I am kind of aware of them, and I'm kind of thinking, this idea of providing what I call an equivalent reading experience. So they are always there in the back of my mind. I perhaps picture also some of my specific individual friends who are poets or translators reading the work too, and kind of, so I suppose there is that. Well, I'm kind of aware my friends and contacts who are themselves translators, and kind of think, I wonder what they'd make of that. Is this such a good idea? I don't know. That kind of thinking. But thanks, that's an interesting question.
Wow, we managed to cover all questions.
Great.
We went over time, but I think that's a good thing. And thank you so much, three of you, for your work, and also everybody who attended. Like I mentioned before, our next event in the series will be next week, next Tuesday. If you are curious to see a little bit different setting with living author and translator and the editor at Open Letter Books, you're welcome. I'm posting the link here in the chat, but it's also widely available on our website and social media. Thank you so much, and I hope we'll see more of your translations published in English, Tom, with good readers and also editors, generous editors and publishers. Thank you so much once again, everybody.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for having us. Yeah, great.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.